My name's Sophie Dakmaki, and I'm here on behalf of the Department for Education. And it's my really great honour to introduce to you today this session, which is How Will This Work? Prevention and Intervention of Youth Bullying and Sexual Violence. And our presenter today is Professor Dorothy Espelage, and Dorothy is from the University of Florida. Beautiful weather, it's one place I'd love to visit in the States. We're really thrilled about the high calibre of presenters that we have throughout the day today for all the sessions. And I recognise that there may be multiple sessions that you want to go to, and it may be difficult making a choice today. So I just want to remind people that these sessions will be taped, and you will have an opportunity through YouTube, and we'll give you all those details to observe other sessions, and they'll be available for a limited amount of time in the next few weeks following today's sessions. So that's just a reminder if you're really feeling torn between the multiple things happening concurrently. So on that note, I'm going to hand over, not take any more time, from a wonderful presentation today from Dorothy.
Great, thank you. Good morning. So a few housekeeping. You'll notice that there's a lot of text on my PowerPoint. I'm not going to read from them. This is because it will be available to you, and as opposed to just having pictures and wondering what I said, there's text, right? So if you want to just spend the next 45 minutes kind of just listening to me, and I'll try not to talk too fast, but I am a fast talker, and this is kind of slow right now for me, so I'm working on this. And I'm being filmed, so that's really great, being from America, and this will be on YouTube, and we have a big election tomorrow, and you can imagine that I need all the prayers in the room. If you're religious, that would be great. Send it to us. And yet another reason for Trump not to like me when he sees this on YouTube, right? Because he knows exactly what we're talking about. So it's a pleasure to be here, and I do in some ways, I feel when we watch Wendy Craig and the brilliant work that they've done in Canada with PrevNet, you need to recognize that there was a lot of money put into that initiative. And so we're kind of in the same boat in the States. We have stopbullying.gov, but our government doesn't put much money into bullying prevention. They just kind of role model it. Anyway, that's it for that. So I typically have a lot of information here. So just see how we do getting through the 45 minutes, and then I'll make a call of whether or not I'll take questions. So we'll see what happens with jet lag, and this is the 7th talk that I've given all over this country. And I took a sleeping pill on Saturday, and I slept through the fire alarm, which was awesome. And so, yeah. So anyway, so I am heavily funded by the federal government, so I'm going to talk to you about 25 years of research on bullying, about 200 peer-reviewed articles, $12 million worth of funding. So there's been lots of studies and lots of books. I am funded by the federal government, but nothing that I say actually reflects anything that they might say in the United States. So I'm going to walk you through a developmental model, and in the description it talked about prevalence and definitions, and in lieu of trying to cover some more interesting things, I will just say that bullying is prevalent. Okay? And we'll talk a little bit about definitions, but I will probably retire, and we will continue to be talking about what's the difference between bullying and teasing. Again, not a good use of your time to debate that here in the next 45 minutes. What I do want you to understand is that the onset of bullying, and bullying itself, whether you engage in that high rates as a perpetrator or victim or someone that has experienced both of those, is really developmental, and it doesn't happen in a vacuum. Things happen in early childhood, aggression that sets the stance, if you will, sets the stage for bullying in late adolescence and early adolescence. And then also we have to understand that some of these predictors of this behaviors are related to family. And I have 45 minutes with you, so I'm just going to try to give you the highlights of what we're finding both in the United States but across the world. So many of our studies look at some of the work that even in the Australian context. So this is what we call kind of a developmental model that I just showed you here. And the theoretical framework, again, you can read if that helps you get through this session. But our theoretical model is complex, and as you heard from Professor Craig earlier this morning, it is very complex when we think about the development of aggression and bullying. And some large of this is centered within the family context, schools, and peers. We also know that kids don't just become bullies, that in fact there's environments that promote this through social learning, whether it's their peers or their family members. We know that kids engaged in high rates of bullying are more likely to see domestic violence in their home. They're more likely to experience abuse. That sets the stage for that type of behavior to then be translated among their peers within the school context. But what you're also going to hear me talk about is that one thing that we've ignored a lot in the area of bullying is trying to understand how bullying then escalates to gender-based harassment and sexual violence. I remember being in Adelaide about 10 years ago when the Safe Schools framework was helping with that particular endeavor, and only found out a couple days ago I was really saddened me that it's only happening now in Victoria. So it breaks my heart, but I remember sitting in the Department of Ed buildings with those flyers in a box, sitting there that were never distributed, right? And so, sorry. I'm also in a country where we did a lot of work around gender and sexual minority youth, and we're going backwards, so much so that the word transgender is probably not going to be in the vocabulary, at least in our vocabulary, for the next 2 years, and hopefully not the next 6. So I'm going to talk to you about that gender-based piece with the hopes that that will be revived within your well-being framework to protect both those kids that are gender and sexual minority youth, which we're going to talk about in the fishbowl. But I also want you to understand that I'm going to show you these sets of analyses, that it's not all about gender and sexual minority. It's actually we're creating, and this is true in the Australian context, that we're creating schools where there's justification for violence against girls and women, right? That sets the stage for later denigration of girls and women over time. Whew, big words. Jet lag and big words, love it. So we're going to talk about that connection really between bullying and sexual violence. And some of you will ask, well, when does this take place? We only know what this connection is because around year 7. And we don't really understand the experiences of kids in the younger ages because, one, we don't ask around gender expression or sexuality at all, right? Right around year 7, your parents feel comfortable with you talking with your kids about this gender-based harassment. So when we think about the definition of bullying, this is a research definition of bullying that Wendy Craig and myself and others across the country, as well as Philip Slee and Rigby out of Australia, adopted from the Norwegian researcher Dan Olveus. And what we're starting to understand is that bullying is different than normal conflicts, than one-off aggressive behaviors, that in fact it's repeated or has the high likelihood of being repeated, because what we find out is kids change their behavior when they are victimized, right? They stop taking lunch, they drop out of sport, they don't go to school. Their parents, if you have school buses, they drive them to school. They change their behavior to reduce the likelihood of that. But we know from the longitudinal studies that if you're victimized, 30 years later you will have a major depressive disorder or generalized anxiety disorder diagnosis. That is not necessarily true for the kids that engage in high rates of bullying. They actually don't have a clinical diagnosis, and many of them fare very well in the academy and also in politics. So the other notion, I'm trying. I really am trying. So I'm just looking forward to the Melbourne Cup tomorrow. That's what I'm going to go bet some on a horse, and that's how I'm going to get through this. I'm going to talk to you about homophobic name-calling. There's 2 countries, the UK and Australia, that really was talking about homophobic name-calling decades ago. Right? And that's why the Safe Schools framework was so important. But homophobic name-calling is essentially being called gay or fag. The big thing now with kids is no homo, right? So you don't want it. Anytime you might like do the bro hug with a boy that's year 6 or 7, you go no homo. And so this language is very, very prevalent in your schools if you ask about it, and across the world. On average, it takes about 25 seconds for my team to hear a homophobic slur when they enter both primary and secondary schools. And sometimes that language comes from teachers, right? So it's also the adults in the building that are modeling these types of behaviors. They're a little sneakier about it. They'll just like, don't be such a wimp, or don't throw like a girl. And you'll hear it on the coach and the sports teams as well. So just giving you some definitions here as we go through this. When we think about sexual harassment and violence, again, we have a federal law against sexual harassment and violence in our schools. We are not compliant with that federal law, and certainly this is a very cause for concern. When we're talking about early adolescence, both in Australia and outside of Australia, we're really talking about unwanted sexual commentary, rumor spreading, and sexting essentially, right? That's what we're talking about. We're not talking about rape and sexual assault. And I often say this, so 3% of our year 5 to year 8 students have been raped. That should be a 0, right? But 3% have. But here we're talking about bantering and unwanted sexual commentary. So I'm going to show you a series of analyses. We have tracked kids with the support of the federal government to try to understand the connection between bullying and gender-based harassment and sexual violence. We have tracked about, let's say, 3,500 kids from year 5 to year 12, something like that, from your ages 10 up to 18. And this is a longitudinal study, so this is the best design that you will see. Now, I could do this entire model, and then your eyes would just roll back in the head, and we're not going to do that. So we're going to break it down for you. In my southern accent, yes, and as the Australian kids said, you have an accent, and I was like, you do too. And so, just want to say, it's just a little different. And the Aboriginal kids where I was the other day said, you listen to Teapot? I said, you mean Tupac? So they now know in Wagga Wagga how to pronounce that. So here what we're breaking down is, if I engage in high rates of bullying, say year 5, year 6, do I then escalate to you're a fag, you're gay? And then does that set the stage for perpetration of sexual violence, which is the unwanted sexual commentary, or in some cases, unwanted touching? Now, it is not a surprise that actually we find, see how fast I'm doing this is so great, that homophobic name-calling is much more prevalent than bullying. So let me just look at me or the figures. When we go in and we survey these kids and ask them about, rumor spreading and teasing and taunting and those types of things, and we do a fancy analysis called cluster analysis, we find that males and females through year 5 to year 8, 12% of them engage in high rates of these behaviors. When we do the same thing with our homophobic scale, and the way we ask this is important in case there's researchers here that want to do this type of assessment, and if you have parents that actually let you ask kids these questions, I'm very fortunate to have that we say, in the last 30 days, some kids call other kids homo, fag, dyke. How many times have you done it to the following people? Friends, non-friends, someone you thought you were gay, someone you didn't like, someone you didn't know their sexual orientation, something like that. Why do we do that? Because the majority of the language of homophobic name-calling is among friendship groups. Doesn't mean they like it, right? We started to do this work when a year 7 student said to me when I was doing interviews, like, lady, your questions are really interesting, but you're not getting to what is the most painful thing among our friends, and that is this homophobe being called fag and gay constantly. And then that year 7 just gave me some research ideas, and we did this. Now, what you'll notice is 1 out of 3 boys here engage in these high rates of perpetration, but the girls also engage in it. Right? So let me say something very clearly to you. Michael Kimmel, the famous sociologist, put it well when he said, girls police boys' masculinity just as much as the boys do. The minute the boys step out of that gendered traditional masculinity box, we attack. The girls also engage in homophobic bantering too. If they're not feminine, you're then a dyke or a lesbo, right? And so this is prevalent. If you're doing bullying prevention work, in what we would call the middle school years between 10 and 12, and you're not talking about this language, you're irrelevant to the kids. Now, it gets such positivity, Dorothy. We also show that bullying, if in fact you engage in high rates of bullying, you will engage in homophobic name-calling over time. So this is across a 2-year period. And as we hypothesized, the bullying sexual violence pathway through the year 5 to 7 held that if in fact you engage in high rates of bullying, you will then engage in high rates of homophobic name-calling, and it sets the stage for sexual harassment. Basic. If in fact somebody's calling me a fag or gay, the best way to demonstrate that that is not an accurate connotation is to sexually harass someone of the opposite sex publicly. So when you think about if you get pushback, what I often say to the conservative folks that are just like, if you talk to them about this, we're gonna turn them all gay. I'm like, I am so powerful, but not that powerful, right? That I say, how many of you, of the conservatives that work with, I'm in the South now in Florida, and they're very conservative, how many of you have daughters in middle school or high school? And when they raise their hand, yeah, go ahead, do it. Raise your hand. Then this shows that your daughter is the object. Your daughter is being used to promote this denigration of girls and women, to promote the traditional masculinity, to maintain the heteronormativity. then they start thinking, oh, wait a minute, she's onto something. Maybe I want to protect my daughters. Okay. So, strong longitudinal associations. If you're looking at bullying prevention in these years, you need to talk about this language. And I am not necessarily asking teachers to talk about the oppression of the LGBT community. I don't think they could do it accurately anyway. But I am asking you, if you hear this language, just say, we don't use that language, right? We don't refer to African Americans with the N word. We don't talk about students with disabilities with the R word. Can we just not use this language? Because in some of our, even including here, if you start talking about some of this, your job is at risk as a teacher. So I'm not asking for that, right? We're back to we'll fire teachers if they come out or they're seen as promoting something other than heterosexuality. Okay, positive, positive, positive. So we even followed these kids into high school. I'm gonna end on a positive note, that'll be good. And so I'm just gonna show you this. So we then followed them up to age 18, and we found very strong effects again. That bullying, perpetration, homophobic name-calling, then it contributed to the sexual harassment. So here we have a 6-year study that as a preventionist, right, yes, I want to talk about bullying, but if we're not talking about the gendered harassment piece of it, then we're not going to slow down the escalation of the sexual violence that we see. We do know internationally that if you are a perpetrator of sexual violence through kind of the homophobic language, that also places you at risk for teen dating violence. So you're taking that power dimension, that traditional masculinity, into your dating relationships. We also know internationally, when you are a victim of teen dating violence or a perpetrator of that behavior, you're more likely to stay in relationships, whether that's marital relationships, that are violent. Right? So we have a lifelong from bullying, right? And you're like, this is a bullying conference. Yes, well, bullying sets the stage for these other forms of aggression, and hopefully that's clear. Lots of things here. Again, when you get the slides, you can read these. This will be much more helpful than me just putting adolescent pictures up there. So the more important piece here is trying to understand how do we break that connection, right? It's not that I just want to come out here and say, oh, these kids it's bad, 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 but we want to be able to minimize that. So in a series of studies, we're trying to unpack the moderators. How can we prevent that connection? How can we break the arrows, if you will, between homophobic name-calling and sexual violence? And we've identified 3 very important moderators, and I'm not going to show the fancy analysis with this, but these are 3 malleable factors that you can do in schools to potentially address sexual violence and the escalation from bullying to homophobic name-calling. And one that is very, very strong for us is this traditional masculinity ideology. And this is this idea that both boys and girls hold that boys need to be physically tough, emotionally stoic, and talk about their sexual prowess. Now you're thinking, you talk to year 6, 7, and 8 kids about? Absolutely we do. And the Plex work goes back to 1995, and we used to talk to boys about multiple masculinities. The traditional masculinity is alive and well, but we can do this work without disrupting, I think, the conservative folks. Because who doesn't want to talk, unless you have some parents that say, why are you talking to my son about emotion, right? But we can, so traditional masculinity moderates that association. We also, as Wendy talked about, we know that kids that engage in high rates of bullying, and also those that are sexual violence perpetrators, if you will, they have need for control and social dominance, right? So I don't know how many of you watched the hearing of old Judge Kavanaugh, but he was very much into social dominance in that high school. And that social dominance played out very, very clearly in the potential sexual assault there. So how do we take these kids that have high social capital and high social need for social dominance and somehow try to minimize this connection? And then the final, which is very, very distressing, girls and boys are quite dismissive of sexual harassment. It's good old victim blaming that is back, right? And if you are not talking to girls and boys about sexual harassment, they will dismiss it. They will just see this as part of just their role. We also have dismissiveness on the part of the adults in our schools. We still have teachers saying, well, what does she expect? Look at the way she dresses. Okay, so this is still alive and well. When we can address this dismissiveness, then we can reduce the sexual violence over time. I feel like I'm just so clear right now. This is like, I'm loving all of this. So if you really have a question, raise your hand, but I think that this is clear, that if you engage in high rates of bullying, it becomes gender-based, but we do have these 3 marital factors that your prevention programs can target. And certainly addressing the traditional masculinity, that's just challenging, but dismissiveness of sexual harassment, simply talking to kids about respecting boundaries and being able to say that we're not going to engage in victim blaming will reduce the sexual violence perpetration. So when I started this work in 1993 in the States, there were about 5 articles written on bullying, right? We were late to the game, right? So Australia was on top of it, Norway, you were on it, everybody was on it, and we had 5 papers, right? Because bullying was just part of being an American, and it made you tough. We now have a couple thousand papers, so we're, and there'll be thousands more. Lots of papers coming out on sexual violence. My job security is so high, it is just amazing. I thought about retiring. I was like, why retire? There's so much work to do, and we're going backwards a little bit. When we think about bullying, I always, and if you've heard my hairdresser story, but this is the best way to summarize the 3,000 articles. So I travel a lot. I just think I hit 150,000 miles already this year. And so I have to have my hair done in different countries and by different people. But what is so classic about hairdressers is they always have a picture of their son or daughter in a soccer outfit, right? Just right there on the mirror, okay? And the point being that the hairdressers, when they say, what do you do? And I say, oh, I'm a researcher. I study school violence. And I say, I study bullying. And, I just really want my scalp scrubbed, and I made the mistake of saying I study bullying. And every hairdresser, doesn't matter what country I'm in, they're like, why? Why do they do it? Johnny, points right to the picture, right? Eli, he was relentlessly bullied. She's like, why? I was like, well, we take a socio-ecological approach, so, Eli, probably has some, was he on the spectrum? Does he have these kind of issues? Yes, he does. I said, well, it's not a deterministic model, so we look at individual characteristics embedded within the family. Like, do you teach him social-emotional learning? But it depends. Who is Eli hanging out with, right? So peers matter, school matter, so that's what we try to take. And then it depends on what country you're in, because if you're in my country right now, it's good luck. And so she's like, oh, as my hair is drying, right? She's like, so it's complicated. It is. What we talk about is the socio-ecological model, knowing that we have risk and protective factors. And at every point of the ecology, you can interrupt that process. That's kind of exactly what Wendy was saying this morning, right? At every opportunity. Because I'll tell you one thing, we have research from the Canadians again, that if we all went and got some genetic testing to see who has that gene to be aggressive, which I think I might be high on that gene. But we're put into, say, a classroom where it's egalitarian, where it's a beautiful, caring, everybody has friends and connections. Your predisposition is not going to be turned on. That switch will stay off. The minute you go into a classroom where the teacher is overwhelmed, has very poor classroom management strategies, we've got some big bullies creating a hierarchical structure, bing, it's going to turn on. So that gene environment is real, but at every point, we can intervene with protective factors over time. Rest assured now, when they ask me what I do, I say I'm a microbiologist. And I study salmonella. So I don't tell them anymore, but it was a good lesson. I do the same thing. I don't say I'm a psychologist on a flight. No, you don't say it. Microbiologist, you guys can take that. So in the individual correlates, we know that there's a wide range of those, and so those range from depression, anxiety, impulsivity. It is very, very clear in the literature internationally that if kids have difficulty regulating their emotions or compromised executive function, they're at risk for both being a victim and a potential perpetrator of these behaviors, right? So lots of things there. This particular slide, I often say a healthy family looks like a healthy school. And this is about 400 articles that an unhealthy school looks like an unhealthy family. So if you're going into the school and you see the principal knowing all the students' names, that's a pretty good sign that that's a positive climate, right? But if you go into a school where you can't find the principal, you can't even really find the children, there's a lack of supervision, attachment, consequences for behaviors, then we're going to have high rates of bullying, but you're going to have high rates of other things, of truancy, of drugs and alcohol use, right? So this really matters, the family and the school context. And remember, you'll get these slides, so that would be helpful. Well, we also find, we do a lot of what's called social network analysis, where we go in and we ask kids who their friends are, and then we look and study them over time to test the homophily hypothesis. Birds of a feather flock together, right? So if you ever, and this is really strange because I just dreamt about Leah O'Rourke, but so I hung out with Leah O'Rourke during adolescence, and my mom's like, I don't like when you hang out with her. You change. And she was right, that my mom was a waitress, so she had no idea of the homophily hypothesis, but she knew that Leah O'Rourke was very popular and very pretty, and I wanted to be her friend because she got invited to all the good parties, right? I'm smart. And the reality is that my behavior over time, so I selected Leah O'Rourke, that's the selection, and then over time I became like her. And she's still pretty on Facebook, and still gorgeous, anyway. But I changed, and I changed into a person. So many of you would have adolescents and some of their friends you don't necessarily care for, right? You want them to be the ones that talk nice to their parents and do their homework. That holds. In the area of homophily, we have found very clearly that if you join a group that engages in high rates of bullying, sexual violence, or homophobic name-calling, within a year time, you will take on these behaviors. And it accounts for a lot of what we call variance. If, in fact, you are doing bullying prevention or gender-based work and you're not looking at those kids that are popular and have high social capital, then you will fail because they're running the schools and they're training all the other kids. And sometimes they're likable, right? They're charismatic. There's a reason they have high social capital. So what we're trying to do is enlist their support into the programming and approaching this through the peer norms. These are brilliant papers and you can look at these networks over time and you can see a kid join in year 6 and 7 where they have low rates of bullying and then they're up because they have to work up the hierarchy, right? And so you see them increase and it's kind of sad. We have to disrupt that and we have failed miserably in that area of bullying prevention. This should be encouraging to you. So I'll try to walk you through this. I'm plotting bullying perpetration here and this shows the connection between the school and the family. So that top line there is if you come from a dysfunctional family, okay? Now, this is defined as arrests, drugs in the home, domestic violence. So I'm talking really chaotic, traumatic home environments. And so that's that top line. As you see at the bottom is low school risk. So these are the schools where there's no violence, there's no gangs, there's no drugs being sold, that it's positive. Now what you notice is those 3 dots there, those are the lowest rates of bullying perpetration. What I want to point out is that first line there. If in fact I come from a home where there's arrests or there's violence, there's abuse, but I go to school in the morning where it's calm and that is not being played out, I have the lowest rates of bullying perpetration. Now, I'm kind of a geek with this stuff, but when I have a theory and it plays out in the data, I'm like, yes. What it shows is, and I've learned that some people are really frustrated because they think, okay, we do all this good work in school and then they go home and it's undone. Well, let's not say that because in fact, the schools are protective. Right? And so I often confess, and more self-disclosure than you need, but I grew up in foster care. And the bottom line is you were never going to change my mom as a teacher, right? She's going to do what she wants to do. She's going to be dysfunctional. I am here because I went to school early. I got in trouble to stay late, detention. And then it was a no-talk detention, so I'd raise my hand and talk, and then it was another day, and I'm like, fine with me. I'll stay here all night. I'll camp out. And so it's because of teachers in schools, right? And this plays out beautifully. You're not going to change the home environment. And I can see where the frustration is, but let's remember, schools are protective. And we owe it to these kids that go home to chaos to have some calmness in those hours when you're with them. Okay. You're learning way more. This is jet lag, and disclosure is a trip. Okay. But, it's powerful because I've had teachers this week say, what am I supposed to do when their home environments are so chaotic? I'm going to look at the data. We also want to show you very clearly, so I do a lot of meta-analyses, and this kind of gives you a summary of the body of literature. So just look at me as opposed to the slide. I've been saying for a very, very long time that we have to do something different with early adolescence around bullying prevention. And what we're doing with the younger kids, we're much more successful with the younger kids, we cannot do with early adolescence. It's just a different developmental timing. And one reason is because kids that engage in high rates of bullying become popular over time. So when you go to a year 2 kid and say, who are the bullies in your classroom and who do you want to be friends with? They name different people. About year 5, 6, who is the bully in your classroom or your school and who do you want to be friends with? Same people. Right? So the kids that engage in high rates of bullying, about 50% of them, we call them Machiavellian bullies. They have heightened theory of mind. They have high social capital. They're not the kids that anybody's going to turn into the principal. So we have to do something different. Remember I talked about homophily? In this combination, you better do something different. Okay. This is another meta-analysis, and this essentially shows, again, just listen to me, right here, that when you have bystander intervention programs, they work with the older kids. Now, remember what happens, and you all remember this, when you're in your, for us, middle school, you just kind of want to, not stand out. You just don't want to be targeted by the bullies, and you just want to fit in, and you want to just get through this awful developmental phase called life, right? And so you don't want to stick up and be an upstander because then you might be the target, right? The minute you get a little bit older, your social capital is distributed more widely into groups. So you might be an academic type, like I was. I was also in sports. I was also hung out with some people that had some, interesting weekend behavior, right? So all of those. So if I stood up for somebody, I may lose that particular friendship group, but I had other ones to turn to. And we found that, and that in fact this meta-analysis was huge. The effect size is 0.44. You don't need to be a researcher to know that as 3 times usually what we find. So at high schools, and it could be the cognitive complexity too, or the empathy is developed more in high school too, but certainly the bystander intervention programs have been successful. There is a Bystandard Revolution happening all over the world, in this idea that we want bystanders to be allies and upstanders. It is not that simple. Girls are more likely to intervene than boys, right? Just because, remember, the traditional masculinity. The little kids will intervene more than others, and then that reverses to the high school, right? We also know that it depends what peer group you're in, and if you think your friend would want you to stand up for somebody, you will. Lots of work that we need to think about. It's not as simple as turning to a kid, giving them a bracelet, and say, be an upstander. They're like, why don't you be an upstander, right? Until the adults do things that's normative, that's upstanding, the kids won't do it. Also, if you're asking them to stick up for somebody, but there's no follow-through and then they're targeted, they will never upstand again. So as a researcher, I get a little frustrated because it's a little Pollyannish to just think that just say no or stop bullying zone. I'm like, they're bullying right in front of the no bully zone. So what's happening here? We're also, this is another meta-analysis, again, just listen to me. Essentially, what we've been, like many, many countries, there's mandating bullying prevention programs at all levels in primary and secondary schools. The problem is we don't have a lot of evidence-based programs for the older kids. So we're taking what's being developed with little kids, plugging it into the older kids, and this is what we get. We fail, right? So we do really well, the effect sizes, just know that this is really bad, and when you get to that line, those 3 studies down there made bullying worse, etrogenic effect. So we have to rethink what we're doing with the older kids. Simply pulling out a curriculum and doing role plays with kids 15 to 18 years old, they're not, and they're telling us, oh, no, you made things worse. Okay, I am doing so well. This is so good, because I wanted to get to this. So we're rethinking the ways in which we work with the 14 to 18-year-olds, and it really is youth engagement, and it's positivity, and we're using these kids as peer leaders. We're finding those that are popular and have high social capital, and this is a study that we're doing now. It's evidence-based for suicide prevention, but they don't really talk about suicide because you can actually prevent suicide without talking about it, right? So you draw on the protective factors, you draw on these students, the peer leaders, and to build trusted adults and trusted peers, destigmatizing mental health, and promoting help-seeking behavior. Let's see. Dan, the man, you think we have some video? We do. Okay, so this is Sources of Strength. This was originally developed in country in South Dakota with our Aboriginal families, and so it I think it has made its way here to Australia, at least I heard that. So this is just one example of the many things that we're doing to promote involvement from youth and taking a positive approach. You noticed on this that we're actually funded to address sexual violence as well as bullying with a suicide prevention program that doesn't mention suicide. Okay, so let's just see how this goes.
Source of Strength is a program that uses peer leaders to go out and try to change social norms and climates across whole populations and spread messages of hope, spread messages of strength and help.
At Sources of Strength, we don't view our peer leaders as junior psychologists or counselors and send them out to fix all of their friends. We really ultimately view them as these agents of social change, and we take what we call a social network approach, that we all exist within these social networks, and we know that things can spread through a network. There's a lot of emergent science on this. What we've learned is that positive things can spread through a network. Things like hope and resiliency and strength and connection and trust towards adults can spread through a network. And so we really view our peer leaders as these agents of social change, as the patient zero of an epidemic of health, of a contagion of strength within their school and community.
I think Sources of Strength is unique in the fact that it's a positive program. It's uplifting. It deals with the strengths that you have around you instead of the negatives.
Sources of Strength is, in the model, aimed not only at addressing the needs of students who may be in crisis to help connect them to natural as well as formal helping resources, but it's also to increase the number of students that have adults that they're in connection with, because we know that's an important protective factor.
What are things that kind of give you strength? Who are people? What are your favorite activities? Source of Strength has peer leader teams going in middle school, high school, college, university, community, cultural groups, as well as faith-based groups. And these peer teams can go out and spread hope, help, strength messages, and they adapt those messages to kind of fit their culture.
Research has shown that we've been able to break down codes of silence, increase perceptions of adult support, increase help-seeking behaviors, and enhance protective factors associated with reducing risk across a whole school population.
Since we started Sources of Strength at our school, we're definitely all more connected and more encouraging to one another, and it feels more like a family rather than just a body of students.
The Sources of Strength program would be great for any school, any community. It creates a caring environment that allows people to feel understood. I just can't say enough good about it.
It supports reaching out, it's against isolation, it's about healthy help-seeking behaviors, it's about life.
The other thing I like about it is we do get assistance on this from outside. It's not all completely in here. We've got people coming in and helping us periodically throughout the year. You need some of those different voices from time to time. It can't always be the same people saying the same things. I think it's good when our students and our staff hear it from people outside.
Sources of Strength isn't a one-shot assembly-style program. It's designed to be implemented over the course of a school year and ideally multiple years, because that's really when we start to see systemic culture change happening.
A program that can address the priorities of the schools, their primary educational mission, as well as the mission of enhancing well-being of students is an important and a wise investment for communities to make.
That's an example of just where we're moving in prevention science around both bullying prevention and the concomitant other forms of aggression that co-occur with this. This program is on the National Registry of Evidence-Based Programs for Suicidal Ideation, Not Behavior, and we just, hot off the presses, after year one in the 11 Sources of Strength schools, we have reductions in sexual violence perpetration, cyber sexting perpetration, largely through increasing help-seeking attitude. So this is pretty amazing. This is a very interesting program because it's organic and it comes from the kids. So the 11 schools that are implementing have 11 different implementation models. And we've trained in those 11 schools now 760 peer leaders, right? These are large schools in Colorado. And so stay tuned. If I'm here next year, I will bring you year 2 results. And yeah, so it's exciting. I'm glad I could share that. That's the first time I've shared that, so you get the special treatment here in Australia. Prior to that, we have done now 5 randomized clinical trials evaluating social-emotional learning. And you're going to hear more about social-emotional learning, I think, maybe this afternoon. This was a large-scale study. What we know from social-emotional learning, if you are in schools where there's SEL exposure, and this is internationally, you're not only you're less likely to be disruptive in the classroom, but your also academic test scores are higher. So this social-emotional learning has been a deal changer really for us in bullying prevention as well as others. And again, you'll get these slides, but these are the different areas of social emotional learning that come out of the CASTLE model, which is out of Chicago, Illinois. And really, all of us need to understand the importance of self-awareness, social awareness, decision-making as teachers, as community members, to know that these life skills, the social emotional skills, really are about workforce development, and we know that these are really, really important as we go through life. We evaluated the second step middle school program, and I'm going to kind of fly through. What we liked about it is built on our research of risk and protective factors. It mentions bullying this much, right? Because bullying, kids know what bullying is, and they're kind of tired of us talking about bullying, right? They want to talk more broadly about well-being and relationships. It incorporates some brain research. It's a very positive approach, and it's developmental for the 10 to 12-year-olds, which was where we're having some challenges. This is a program that's implemented by teachers, and we train the teachers, because what we know in the research, too, is some of our teachers are lacking in social emotional learning. So we get kind of the training, the teachers enhance their social emotional learning across, this is grades 6, 7, and 8, so ages 10 to 12, 13. And so I love that I do this like 3-year nested design, longitudinal, randomized clinical trial, and I can summarize the results in one slide, right? All that work, and we get one slide. So we actually had 36 schools in Illinois and Kansas, largely the Midwest, about 3,600 kids. 18 of the schools got second step for 3 years, and 18 was business as usual. And we found reductions out of the gate in the first year, 42% reduction in physical fighting. And that was pretty significant by simply doing social emotional learning, right? They weren't throwing punches anymore. And that's significant because our Healthy People 2020 initiative, which we're at 2018, was to reduce physical fighting by 3%. We've reduced it by 42% by simply talking to kids about empathy, perspective taking, relationship skills, emotion regulation. We also reduced homophobic name-calling and sexual violence perpetration in year 2 and year 3. We also found huge effects when the teachers implemented the program as intended. When the teachers took this curriculum on as they would math, science, and reading, right? It was just part of the curriculum, it was integrated. We had reductions of 50 to 70% of these outcomes. We also then tracked these kids up till they were 18 years old. What we found, and this goes back to kind of the sources of strength, if you were in a second step school, your school sense of belonging over that 3 years went up. And then we found reductions 3 years later in sexual harassment, victimization, and homophobic name-calling. Because if you're focusing on the larger school climate and social-emotional, there's no room actually to be called a fag, right? If in fact it's a positive climate, it wouldn't fit right. And so that's very encouraging results. However, I also want to suggest, and I think we've heard this from others, Wendy, that you can have an evidence-based program, but if you're bringing that evidence-based program into a chaotic school where the adult climate is toxic, it will fail, okay? And so we also, when I went in and recruited these 36 schools, which you can imagine is a big job, I also saw 36 different climates. And I called my funder and I said, I need $50,000 because I need to measure school climate right now because I can tell you where it's going to work, where they're going to uptake, and where it's going to be sustained. And so these are just some baseline data just to give you some sense of how school climate matters. So we went in and we surveyed all of the adults, about 1,400 of them, mostly teachers, but a cafeteria worker and a bus driver who really wanted to say something. And this is very complex models here, but and this goes along with what I was saying before, when teachers are intolerant of sexual harassment and homophobic name-calling with a lens toward gender equity, the kids bully less and they're victimized less because 30 to 50% of bullying is often homophobic in nature. If they're simply just not allowing that language, there's major reductions. Also, less homophobic name-calling, right? And these are very, very complex models, so it's truth, right? Okay, so just to give you some exciting things that we're thinking about youth involvement, we are looking at meta-analysis looking at sexual violence outcomes for our kids. We're very much concerned about sexual violence and the rise in sexual violence in the last 2 years. We're also trying to figure out what is working in the area of cyberbullying interventions. So we're coding in the meta-analysis 55 studies. So hopefully within the next 6 months, there will be a huge paper coming out so that we can figure out, do we have to have a separate program for cyberbullying, or will our social, emotional, or well-being programs actually move the needle on that, right? So what I didn't say in our studies, we reduced cyberbullying without a really heavy dose of that conversation. It's because what we do know is if you engage in high rates of bullying face-to-face, you will engage in those rates of behavior when you go home on your computer, and they're the same people usually, right? So the question is, maybe we just need to talk about digital citizenship and protections of passwords and those things, but maybe social emotional learning or a well-being framework would create civility such that it doesn't spill over. So stay tuned for that. We also are creating a pro-social bot. And we've gone into a feminist channel on YouTube and scraped 30,000 comments. People say the awful things about feminists. And what we're doing is training a robot to then come back and say pro-social comments to try to kind of break down that bullying that's happening. So we'll let you know how that goes, because if any of your kids have a YouTube channel and they think they can sing, people will tell them that they can't sing, and they will say it in not such nice ways. And then our bystander's going to be like, well, at least you know, like, stop being so mean. I don't know what it's going to look like. We'll see. We also just developed, because like you, it is challenging to come in and do this work on top of everything else that teachers are asked to do, right? Their plate's full. They're stressed out. They're not paid enough, right? They can barely go to the bathroom on a regular basis. So we have now developed a text messaging program that includes some of the same social emotional learning, the self-awareness, all of those, empathy, perspective taking. And the kids can have it and they can learn social emotional learning either to booster what's happening in their schools, or they can do it in their own time and they can learn these strategies. So let me know if you want those papers. It's called Bully Down. Okay, so in conclusions, I think I demonstrated that there's a strong support for the bullying, sexual violence pathway, and really pointing to those malleable factors of traditional masculinity and dismissiveness of sexual harassment. Peer norms matter. What are you doing to bolster those peer norms so that they're more pro-social versus toxic? And we need to pay attention, as Wendy said, the adults in the building. In bullying prevention, for the first 15 years of my research agenda, we have virtually ignored teachers. There's only 25 papers written on teachers and bullying, right? And now we learn that teachers are also at risk for being the victims of bullying, both online and in the classroom. That's another line of research I wasn't able to talk about. And it is clear that social emotional learning programs, which you guys would call well-being programs, are moving the needle when they're implemented with fidelity as intended. So find a program that fits the time that you have, the resources that you have, and we know that when they're implemented with fidelity, we're going to get these outcomes. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you for all the head nods. I always focus on right there. She was like, I was like, keep it coming. Keep it coming. Plenty of time for questions. Yes?
Wendy Craig this morning focused a great deal on socialising adults, but really sort of took a whole lot of stuff around parents and the role of parents. And Shafia and I both with a parent organisation. How do parents get caught in that ecological framework that you're launching in your study?
Yeah, so let me just repeat the question. So the question was related to how do parents fit into the ecological framework? I wish they fit in more. So on the research side, it's very challenging to get parents to participate, to even understand their role. And the parents you do get to participate that shows up for your trainings are not all the parents that you need, right? So on the research side, it's limited. When we look at, and I just have a paper that just was accepted on in bullying prevention programs, how do they include parents, right? And I can send you this, and you will find it very interesting. For the most part, they send stuff home, information like, oh, we're doing this bullying prevention program at school, right? And we know what happens when things are sent home, right? They stay in the backpack and they don't, But then there was another layer of intervention programs, largely in Europe, because they have such strong support for bullying prevention, where they actually brought the parents in to do a training, a face-to-face. Then there was a third type where they not only brought them in, but they actually had pull-through activities. So they would have homework assignments where I need to sit down with my mom and we're gonna go through some empathy or perspective taking, emotion regulation, or we do belly breathing together. I mean, it depends on the age. And what we find is that reductions of bullying are higher when there's more authentic engagement of the parents. But there's not many of these bullying prevention programs out there that have done this. Now, we tend to see the parents more involved at the secondary or the tertiary level, like the family checkups, right? So those kids that are kind of really having challenging behaviors. But at universal prevention, there's less of that. So email me and I'll send you that paper because that's hot off the presses, and the message is very, very clear that we need to do more parental engagement, and researchers need to track what they're doing better. Because they could be doing really good things with the parents, but they're not describing it in such a way that it's helpful. Yes?
In the lead up to us nationally and in this state losing the Safe Schools program or evolving, there were a lot of very loud voices saying, why do LGBTIQ kids get their own program? What about the fat kids? What about the disabled kids? And we know that 80% of LGBTIQ kids report bullying, but there was a figure that you just said that I hoped you could re-clarify, that 30 to 50% of all bullying is homophobic in nature?
The content, yes. So if you do the analyses, if you take that bullying scale with my homophobic scale, and we've done this consistently, and they found it in Ian Rivers' work in the UK 30 years ago. 35 to 50% of the name calling that's directed toward me is homophobic in nature and gender-based.
So it doesn't matter if you're LGBTIQ
It doesn't
or not,
matter
the
at all.
content is.
Absolutely not. And there's papers. So remember how I said we did that social network analysis and I get friendship groups? This type of bantering among heterosexual peers leads to depression and anxiety. And these kids are not identifying as LGBT. So I've written a lot in my work that this is not about just a program for LGBT. If in fact you have what we have called gay straight alliances in the United States, where you bring together kids of different levels of sexual orientation, because we say LGBT, but there's like 60 different ways to describe your sexuality at this point. When you bring them together to do student programming, both at the middle school and the high school, we certainly wouldn't want to do it with the younger kids, because again, we could be trained. When you do that, you have low rates of bullying, perpetration, and victimization, all kids, right? So the way I sell this is, now one, it's a difference because the LGBT kids that are victimized have higher rates of suicidality. The problem is those loud voices will say, well, no kidding, look at the lifestyle they've chosen, right? So it's complicated. But what we need to understand, that's why I've taken that different angle of we're creating hostile environments for all kids. The majority of kids in middle school just want to play Fortnite. They don't want to be, they just want to play Fortnite, and they don't want to be called fag, and they haven't really thought about what they like except for Fortnite. And so, but they will say, so get the voice of your kids that identify as straight or non-LGBT. Do the research study, if you could do it, to counter that, because that is extremely, and the teachers are unhappy with this language you're creating. If you're focusing on a positive school climate, all the kids will benefit. However, I do believe that students with disabilities, LGBT youth, immigrant populations, kids with health conditions, cancer, diabetes, they're all at a different type of risk. And we call these groups out, but I don't know. You see, it's a very nuanced type of argument. So what are you going to do? You're going to wait till you have the suicide rate that we have? 40% of LGBT youth have attempted suicide in the last 6 months. Is that what you're waiting for? Right? Yeah. Anyway, if the election goes the way it goes, in 2 years I'm coming here and I'll fight with you, okay? Brisbane or Adelaide, those are my 2 cities. I'm down to 2.
I have a question and kind of a comment that backs up everything you're saying. My daughter is almost 18, and this happened when she was in year 7, so it's a few years ago. She's autistic and she identifies as pansexual. It would have been for over a term. She was being cornered and she developed quite young, inappropriately being touched by boys for ages. Now, I work in this field. I talk openly with my children all the time. How do we teach children that it's not their fault? She had so much embarrassment, guilt and shame. She wouldn't tell anyone, and she ended up in psych, suicidal, like you're saying. So everything, how do we teach them, like in my workplace, I've still got younger children, how do we teach them that things aren't their fault and they can tell people and talk to people?
Well, ideally is that you do it as early as possible, as much as possible, right? And that shame is very real for her. But if we're not talking to kids about their boundaries, the respect for those boundaries, both on the perpetrator and the victim side, right? So but those boys were justified. And did they then, was it dismissed by the adults in the building? Like, it's so complex.
Those boys, nothing really happened. They said, she's okay. And we were moving, so we were moving schools, so there was no consequence for them because she's leaving anyway. So that's and she said to me, people can do what they like, so yeah.
Yeah, and it's quite, and what you're talking about is intersectionality, and I'll talk about that in the fishbowl, I think, this afternoon, is that so students with disabilities that identify as non-heterosexual, when they're victimized, high rates, exactly what you're talking about, so that plays out. And then if you add a third identity, then you have a heightened risk as well. So an Aboriginal, that's with the disability that identifies as non-heterosexual, 3 strikes against you, right? We can continue to add to that, understanding that intersectionality. But until the adults do the right thing in this country and in my country, we're fighting. Like, you guys have gone backwards, we're going backwards, and it's going to have to be, honestly, what's happening in our country, and hopefully it's happening here, is the youth are really becoming quite disturbed by what's happening, right? Because they understand gender on a spectrum. They get the continuum, right? It's the adults in the room, there's like, what's pansexual, what's cisgender, right? At some level, my training of teachers in the United States is at a basic level. Many teachers don't know the difference between sex and gender expression, gender identity, and then you're gonna throw them 60 more terms. They like go into a coma, right? And then they feel like, oh my gosh, I'm a teacher and I don't know the 63 different ways of describing my sexual orientation. Well, I'm up to 21. That's the best I can do, and I study this. So until there's protections for these groups, we're going to continue to see these mental health tragedies, actually, to be honest.
We'll probably got just one more.
One more.
Time for one
this
more
guy,
question.
Yep. Sorry, that was so loud.
I may have misheard you. I think you said something about stopping the use of some language in schools, for instance, the use of gay. I have an issue with that and have had experience in school where the way teachers responded to students using the word gay as a put down was to go, that's a terrible thing to say, don't say that. I experienced that, and other students experienced that as saying being gay is the worst thing you could be. Don't call somebody that because it's terrible. So we did some training around responding to that as there's nothing wrong with being gay, don't use that word as a put down. And I see that still where teachers and others think they're doing the right thing by going don't, and all it does is send a message to anyone who's not heterosexual, cis, that shit is really bad because they're telling that's the worst thing you can call them. And I really think we need to change that really quick because of the message it sends with best intentions.
Absolutely, and we have a nice guidance sheet that we use largely from the Anti-Defamation League of different ways that you can respond to that language. But it depends on where you're at. So if you're in the state of Florida and you then proceed to say, well, it's not so bad to be gay, you can get fired. We have no homo laws in Minnesota. So if someone comes to you and says, I think I'm bisexual, you cannot engage in a conversation. It's a no homo law. You cannot do anything. You can't support that student. So it varies, right? So in some of the schools, the best they can do is like, please don't use that language, right? Without going into that's bad, just we don't use that language. In other schools, they can talk about the history and what that means and be supportive of that community. So it just depends on the climate. I like that. I'm going to follow up on that. I really appreciate, because oftentimes these are these unintended consequences, right? That we're not, because we're trying to be attentive, but then it may lead to this etrogenic effect. Thank you for that. Yeah. Beautiful. Thank you so much for being so attentive.